Good morning and welcome to the first of our panels in the 2022 Alaska Historical Society Annual Conference. I'm David Ramseur, the current president of the Society's board, and I've got my own presentation on Alaska-Russia relations next Thursday, so I'm happy this panel is serving as our guinea pigs. Today we'll be hard-pressed to top the compelling keynote presentation we heard last night from Bathsheba DeMuth. It was certainly an honor for a scholar and author of her caliber to kick off our annual conference. This morning, we also have some fascinating presentations under our general theme of contested figures and events in Alaska history. And there's no shortage of controversial characters throughout Alaska's history, and today we're going to hear about several. We're giving each of our speakers about 25 minutes, ideally about 20 for their presentation, and 5 for questions immediately after each presentation. And that should give us a little bit of time at the end for comments or additional questions. So let's jump right in with Russ Vanderlugt, who just completed his PhD dissertation focused on Indigenous military relations. Russ was recently appointed Director of Strategy, Plans, and Policies at the Alaska Command here in Anchorage. And Russ's presentation is about Ivan Petroff, the 19th century Russian-born historian and self-taught Alaskan expert. So Russ, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, David. Go ahead and share my screen here. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. While completing my dissertation on the 1885 Henry Allen expedition, I wrestled with the credibility of published sources in the late 19th century, which led me to examine several leading individuals behind these sources. The result was a chapter that took shape as a case study that looked at credibility of these individuals. So I eventually cut this chapter from the dissertation due to its scope, but this presentation represents just a few excerpts. And I appreciate feedback following this talk and thank all those who contributed to the research, including Terrence Cole, who left a box of microfilm in his old office where I was assigned to write my dissertation, and which turned out to be duplications of Ivan Petroff's papers from the Bancroft library. So I found myself tackling not only Henry Allen, but Ivan Petroff. As I conducted a review of literature and cartography of Alaska during the 1880s, I noticed that one of Alaska's fundamental problems, both then and now, is that the region is so vast, so remote, and complex and diverse that no one, if we're to be honest, can be an expert on all of it. During the 19th century, with little published on Alaska, or more correctly, Alaskas, to be an expert and understand the region, one had to A, physically go there and accomplish field work, or B, vastly generalize observations across wide-ranging and diverse regions, or C, incorporate others' work into your own without necessarily verifying the data, or in many cases without citing it, which, granted, there were fewer citations back then, and in many cases they were considered unnecessary. Though Petroff gets most of the attention and serves somewhat as a scapegoat in the latter arena, he was certainly not the only expert running the course in this manner. Most experts were self-proclaimed or elevated by the press through their own publications. So-called experts also forged through fiercely competitive adventure journalism in the Gilded Age. So in the late 19th century, Alaska was a competitive scene for those desiring to connect their fortunes and career success to Alaska's anticipated political and resource development. Hitching one's success to Alaska's future required knowledge of the region. In short, being an Alaska expert. If Alaska was vast enough to enfold the wildest dreams of its boosters, its expansionists, and profiteers, it was too small to contain the egos and ambitions of outsiders clamoring to be considered the region's true experts. The result was fierce competition rather than collaboration, impacting the value and veracity of period sources, which often conflicted, much like the relationships of their authors. So, no single person, indigenous or otherwise, had individually experienced the extent of the territory. Therefore, individuals and their written sources claiming expertise and knowledge of the land were often forced to make assumptions about what they had not seen. This pattern, claiming surety for things still uncertain, was so pervasive among scientists and explorers of the 19th century that from our perspective today, it appears to be a cultural norm. In contrast, indigenous peoples refrained from speaking about what they did not know, instead perfecting their local knowledge. And not surprisingly, the newly minted experts or outsiders found their greatest success in Alaska when consulting and collaborating with indigenous residents and combining knowledge sources from this vast region to understand its great complexity. With varying degrees of consultation, information regarding Alaska's interior found its way for the first time to press in the American press and was consumed by the American public in the late 19th century. Okay, I'm advancing my slide here, and this is the outline slide, what I want to talk about. And I have very limited time, so I'd like to discuss several Alaska experts who contributed significant sources throughout the era and their competitive relationships, including William Dall, George Davidson, Henry Elliott, and Ivan Petroff. There are others, but I want to focus primarily on Ivan Petroff. And I'm working on a project of connected biographies that synthesizes the contributions of these individuals. So this is what I hope to cover, and please note that the question or problem there at the bottom of the slide as well. Ivan Petroff, special agent. I chose him because he was responsible for both the 1880 and 1890 census in Alaska, and he authored and translated the most significant and highest volume of source material on the region during the 1880s. And for the Alaska Historical Society Board of Directors to consider, as they did back in 1890, Petroff was an esteemed honorary member of the Alaska Historical Society. And there's his membership. As mentioned, here are several candidates based on their contributions. Henry Elliott, a larger-than-life expert on Alaska, as we shall see. He ardently supported Petroff's credibility. William Dall was known by many as the region's first American expert after publishing Alaska and its Resources in 1870. He was dubbed the Dean of Alaska Experts by both the Smithsonian and historian Morgan Sherwood. And he attempted to diminish the sources and contributions of both Petroff and Elliott. George Davidson, a Pacific Coast expert sought by William Seward to collect and publish information and promote the Alaska Purchase, shared with his colleagues privately that he did not think highly of Dall. Elliott likewise attacked Dall. Henry Allen provided a wealth of information on interior Alaska through his reports and journals, but Allen never returned to Alaska after his 8 months of crisscrossing the region in 1885. Allen is also perhaps unique because he made no claim to be an Alaska expert, and nor did he seek recognition by publishing commercially following his time in Alaska. Allen he actually turned down several opportunities to publish, including the urgings of Dall, who was full of praise for Allen. Rivaled only perhaps by Allen's remarkable expedition in 1885, Petroff may have amassed the greatest distances in his many muscle-powered travels and census fieldwork in Alaska in both the 1880s and early 1890s, providing another reason to focus on his firsthand experiential aspects in his sources. In fact, as Petroff arrived to take the census in 1880, Dall departed Alaska, completing his last field season. In fact, Dall's absence from Alaska in the 1880s provided ample room for Petroff's ascendancy as the preeminent regional expert. Dall, in fact, revealed he had lost his ambition for fieldwork here in far-flung Alaska, writing as he departed, quote, "I hope to return to Washington and settle quietly down for study, as I think 7 years of one's life are quite enough to be devoted to fieldwork in such an inaccessible region." Dall accepted a permanent appointment on the Coast Survey and became the honorary curator of mollusks at the Smithsonian in 1881. Conversely, Petroff sought continuously to be assigned in Alaska from the late 1860s through his census duties in 1890 to 1891. He chose to reside with his family at a remote posting in Kodiak for a majority of the 1880s while serving as customs collector. So what did Petroff contribute? Here's a short list here. In the interest of time, I would say that in addition to his literary output and his far-ranging Alaska travels, Petroff deserves a central role because of his facility with languages. Petroff's Russian and English were flawless, though his place names lack standardized orthography. One of the few individuals who came remotely close to Petroff's linguistic ability was Henry Allen. All Dall could really claim was academic facility in Latin. Like Allen, Petroff read over a dozen European languages with ease, and given his linguistic talent, he could decipher various Alaska Native languages and their groupings. And most significantly, Petroff's ability to communicate to a degree with indigenous residents as he traveled extensively lent credibility to his sources, especially indigenous sources that referred to areas he could not visit during his census enumeration. As an example, Petroff compiled indigenous word lists, including one with Stafif, and that was a vocabulary they compiled in 1885, which was one of the most extensive word lists on Dene in the 19th century. Scholars, though, tend to disparage Petroff for his tendency to augment archival sources with insights from his travels and experiences, and to fabricate accounts. So 3 specific examples I've listed here are his fabrication of the Journal of Father Juvenal, writing a fake account as a correspondent for the San Francisco Chronicle, and altering translations for the U.S. State Department in connection with the Bering Sea arbitration. And that's what eventually ended his career. In the context of Petroff's outrageous fabrication of Father Juvenal's journal, Terence Cole jocularly wrote that Ivan Petroff holds the distinction of probably telling more lies about Alaska that are believed for more years than any other person. In many cases, Petroff's contributions are overshadowed by his very duplicitous tendencies. However, given the volume Petroff produced on this remote region during a period when little information was available, it's critical not to make the mistake of allowing these fabrications to corrupt Petroff's entire life corpus. For certain places, Petroff's account may be all scholars have to analyze. Indeed, Petroff was both a gifted expositor and a forger who possessed the uncanny ability to tailor his writing to what his boss or his readership wanted to hear. His facility with languages and the written word, coupled with his travels in Alaska, place him among the foremost experts on the region. And despite his checkered career, Petroff's knowledge, skills, perspectives enrich our understanding of Alaska's diverse past. Now, if we had more time, I would love to describe the secondary literature on Petroff, but I've created a brief collage here and would just say that the first biographical source was Bancroft's Literary Industries, and then a flurry of publication after silence of 70 years, a flurry in the 1960s led by Sherwood and then by Pierce, and followed by the Hinckleys and Lydia Black. And then the only recent article is an excellent one written by Kenneth Pratt, where he looked at Petroff's 1891 census and determined it to be about 84% on point. So a more rational approach here, despite the fact that some scholars have recommended dismissing all the sources authored by Petroff owing to these mistakes, is to use a comprehensive approach to these so-called tainted sources and not discard the entire corpus and thus throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Petroff, in his controversial role, just requires scholars to look closely and examine the validity of his writings as they study. So I'm going to move on quickly here to give you just a brief background of Petroff here, his formative years. Petroff wore his heart on his sleeve. He was subservient, accommodating, and overall likable personality. He married Emma Stanfield of Napa Valley in 1876, and that was 4 years before the 10th census. And he remained married to her until his death. Emma delivered their only child, Olga, in 1877. And we have Petroff's letters to both Emma and Olga, which really show us Petroff's genuine love and commitment to his family. Petroff's own childhood was exceedingly difficult, and his motivations, I've found, throughout much of his adult life can be traced to gaining the love and acceptance that he lacked as a boy, and his lingering grief. A few facts not previously known about Petroff that affected his development. He was born a twin in St. Petersburg, but he lost his twin brother at the age of 3 months. Moreover, Petroff's mother, Sophia Lanin, also died during Petroff's infancy. His father, named Ivan Petroff, was killed in 1854 at the Battle of Inkerman during the Crimean War, leaving young Ivan an orphan when he was 12 years old. At this young age, Petroff was placed in the 1st St. Petersburg Cadet Corps, and given his propensity for languages, he was transferred to the Imperial Academy of Sciences for training as a military interpreter. A serious illness, though, and a resultant speech impediment altered Petroff's path. So he continued with general language studies in Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, Armenian, French, German, Spanish, Italian, and English. And as we know, he later mastered several Alaska Native languages and dialects. Now, I was going to share with you one of the letters that Petroff wrote to Emma. It recalls a childhood memory. And I'll briefly summarize it just in the interest of time. But basically, he tells Emma about a time in his youth when he was at military school. Both his parents were already dead. And he writes, "I had nobody belonging to me except an old uncle who didn't seem to like me much. I saw very little of him, but in the summer of 1855, he came to me once and said if I gained a prize at examinations, he would take me home for the holidays. That was a great treat for boys to go on a vacation. And the teacher who had to stay at school on account of the few that did not act very kindly toward those who had to stay behind. So I worked hard all summer," he wrote, "and when the exam came off on the 6th of December, I gained first prize in my class in French and German. My uncle was there, but when the exercises closed, he told me coldly that I had won a prize if I had won a prize in anything but foreign nonsense, he would have taken me home. But he would leave me at school to study something useful. And with that, he left me. My disappointment," writes Petroff, "as you can imagine, for I was only a boy at the time and no place to go. I was 13 years old, and I must confess that tears stood in my eyes when I walked up the stairway to our deserted sleeping rooms. On the stairs, I met a staff officer who had been at the exams and stopped me and asked me the cause of my apparent trouble. He laughed when I told him my story and said, 'Never mind, boy. In a dozen years or so, you will be a man and have a home of your own and perhaps boys of your own. And then you will know enough to take them home for Christmas.' That was the 6th of December, 1855, but our Russian almanac was still according to the old style, 12 days behind the new, which would make it the 18th in the United States. So on that very day, when the officer made me hope for a home of my own, the person was born who made me so happy by promising to share it with me. Yours faithfully, Ivan." And he wrote this to Emma. Emma was actually born on the 18th of December, so the very day that he encountered the staff officer, the Russian staff officer that shared that with him. So I share that letter briefly with you to show you kind of Petroff's heart and some of the things he dealt with as a child that I think did influence his motivations as an adult. Now, I was going to save a discussion on Petroff's U.S. military record, which deserves further review, I think, to verify his credibility, and has been the topic of debate for the Q&A session, because this is almost a whole separate discussion. But bottom line, so I'm not going to go into it now. He was a deserter, But I found some additional information thanks to digitization and search engines. So building upon Richard Pierce's research, what I found boosts Petroff's reputation in this regard, and look forward to sharing that. Petroff also he clearly struggled as financially as a young man, and continued to seek various jobs, with the added burden of supporting his family between California, where he worked for Bancroft, and trips to DC and Alaska. So one of the things that he did was founding and publishing the Alaska Appeal, which is funded by advertisers in Sitka. And this he did just before his first census assignment in 1880. And really, the paper was an appeal for civil government and democratic progress in Alaska. And note the emboss up there of the Bancroft Library, his employer. Father Honcharenko was his inspiration for this. He had published the first newspaper exclusively addressing Alaska affairs, and comes to play later on in Petroff's life, which hopefully we'll get some time to mention later. In a letter to William Dall, Petroff expressed his motivation really for this paper. He wanted to gain a secretariat position should Alaskan government materialize. So he wrote to Dall in 1879, "During my absence in Alaska, letters from your pen have appeared in the New York Herald. I believe you propose a plan of a simple territorial government with a governor, a Russian-speaking secretary, and a circuit judge. That would be an excellent idea, which I should like to discuss at length in my paper, the Alaska Appeal. And I should also like to know if any congressman or senator has taken up the idea and intends to present it before Congress. I may as well confess to you that I'm very much interested in this question and intend to make an effort for the secretariatship, should your plan be realized. I know I possess the necessary qualifications, and I think I can get some good endorsements. Sincerely, Petroff." All right. Well, skipping ahead again, this is some of the outputs here. This is the 1880 census, and it shows how Petroff divided Alaska. And he was solely responsible for this effort, which is pretty incredible considering the size of Alaska. This is a little-known map that shows Petroff's routes specifically. And if I zoom in on this one, this is his route just in 1880, and you'll notice it shows native settlements, trading posts, missions, and the extensive ground that Petroff did cover. He claimed, he gained praise in the press for having completed a journey of 8,000 miles, 2,500 of which through a portion of Alaska never penetrated by an outsider. So looking at this, he produced a very advanced map for the time, which relied heavily on the Kandick map, an indigenous source map. This map was then later copied by Dall in 1884. You can see there's very little change in the river drainages. And I looked at this specifically in my dissertation on the evolution of cartographic knowledge. And even more importantly, Petroff's ethnographic map here is really excellent and a huge improvement on Dall's from 1875. And I put this up, the Alaska Native Language Center map up here in the left corner, to show really how little it changed from Petroff's 1880 version, published in 84. And these numbers indicate the very subdivision inside of here. The yellow is the Dene language and the subdivisions. And zooming in further, actually this is compares Dall's 1875 and Petroff's 1880 census ethnographic map. So you see there's a little difference there. And these on the right here, it shows all the various native languages. And he separates them by dashed lines and then numbers inside of the larger language families. And lastly, this is Petroff's route in 1881, which has not been analyzed by scholars. This is an approximation, but it shows where he traveled, both Cook Inlet, Prince William Sound, and then the delta of the Copper River east to Cape Yaktag, as he writes it here in his map. Okay, so that was a real quick overview on just some of the contributions there from the 1880. I see I'm almost out of time, and I may have to jump ahead. I will say here, as we look at Petroff versus Dall, that Dall did not entertain Petroff as a colleague, but he also could not ignore his criticism. Okay, and this was how Dall established himself. Of course, most of us know of Alaska and its resources, and there's a color version of an ethnographic map. But Dall took Petroff as an attack on his fortress of knowledge and authority, and went on a campaign of several talks, lectures, and publications that basically undercut Petroff's work in the 1880s, even though Dall was primarily operating out on the East Coast. And one of his major mistakes was overlooking or trying to combine EAC, both the people and the language. And Michael Krauss and De Laguna called Dall out on that aspect, and as one of his major mistakes that was then passed down through decades of scholarship until it was finally corrected in the 20th century. And also something that I do not want to get in depth with here, but George Davidson, I mentioned earlier, did not think highly of Dall, and Eliot and Dall also very much at odds. And this was a popular rendition of the 1880 census that was published for Petroff, the quote best living authority on the subject. Okay, so I'm looking. David, you can chime in, but I think I'm looking short on time, so I'm going to skip ahead to my conclusion here. And
yes, please.
Okay. All right. Well, so this has been a fast and furious overview, and I look forward to presenting again, perhaps part 2 in the future. But in conclusion, though we all have much respect for William Dall, as compared to Ivan Petroff, Petroff does not get due credit for his contributions, and I argue that he needs to be more closely studied. This is his grave. It is unmarked. There is no gravestone. It's just marked by the red roses here in a cemetery outside of Philadelphia. So he's very much anonymous. After he was fired from the State Department, his career quickly spiraled downward, and he faded into obscurity. But I would argue that we owe, as scholars and historians, we owe a closer look at Petroff. And so I strive to do that, both through my research and as I look to get feedback from those listening today, in a future publication of Petroff's work specifically. So Petroff's work, though diminished by his falsification of Russian documents, I argue that he did not act alone in that, and that he was under duress during that time. He did do several falsifications throughout his career, so I'm not diminishing that fact at all. But truly, his 1890 census, his Alaska history that he wrote under Bancroft's name, but he wrote a majority of it, and then most importantly, his 1890 census, which really hasn't been studied, and I look at that in my lit review, are very important monuments and contributions to Alaska history, and deserve our utmost attention as historians. Thank you.
Thanks, Russ. Fascinating presentation. I know I have a handful of questions here, but in the interest of time, why don't we defer questions on your presentation until we get the other 2 speakers in. Next is long time, and to encourage people, if you do have questions, feel free to pose them online. So next is longtime Alaska historian and author Jim Barnett, whose focus has been primarily on the surveys of Captains Cook and Vancouver in Alaska. Jim is a former president of the Cook Inlet Historical Society, and he will re-examine the legacies of Cook and Vancouver and maybe shed a little light on the contemporary controversy over Cook's statue in downtown Anchorage. Jim, take it away.
Thank you very much, David. I unfortunately couldn't get my screen to work, so I'm working with Cody on the PowerPoint, and we'll just hope that Cody can get it up. There it is. Okay, fantastic. And I'll just say next, Cody, each time I want to switch a slide. As most of you are aware, the post-colonial view of history is a modern attempt by historians to better understand the impact of colonialism on indigenous societies. This new understanding has had a dramatic impact on the study of Captains James Cook and George Vancouver, British explorers who mapped the Pacific from the Arctic to Antarctica, encountering a host of indigenous people along the way. When the Alaska Historical Society announced its theme this year, Conflicting Visions in Alaska History, I welcome the challenge to reassess the legacy of these captains. We know their maps ultimately led to conquest and colonization. My effort is to be more nuanced, offering an analysis that focuses on their leadership and the voyage interaction with the local people. Since I have studied this topic frequently, this work involved new research recently and a bit of personal introspection about the voyage outcomes. I've written a full paper, but of course today we just have a few minutes, and I'll offer some highlights in the PowerPoint format. The first slide, of course, shows Cook in Vancouver and generally summarizes what they were up to. Cook had 3 separate voyages beginning in 1768 that fundamentally disproved the theories of the southern continent, which was then called Terra Australis, and the imagined maritime passageway between Europe and China, the Northwest Passage. Vancouver came back in his survey to principally survey the area from San Diego all the way to Anchorage, to verify that each of the nooks and crannies did not contain that imagined passage. Next. There we go. So the issue today is, what is their legacy? Some will argue that the captains were invaders, charting coastlines, giving place names, taking possession, conquering nature and classifying plants, animals, and people, and that they were the first of an advancing empire that pillaged the native people. Others consider their legacy untarnished, toiling on arduous journeys in wooden ships, the furthest temperate shores from England, multiple year voyages, maintaining the best possible relations with the local people. Next. Next. There we go. Okay. We all know they have statues. The collage I have here, I suppose, is some that are not ruined and some that have been ruined. Cook in Hyde Park, Sydney is probably the largest of all the statues. The upper left, lower left is Cook in Waimea, which is the same statue that was copied from Whitby that is in Resolution Park in Anchorage. But as you know, Cook has been a controversial figure of lately. The next one, Good Riddance, is a statue of Cook that was soiled, vandalized by people in Melbourne. I think you've all heard about the statue in the Victoria Harbor, which was dumped in the drink last year during the Canada Day celebration. This was the plinth that remained, and the plinth has now been removed. Some of the Cook statues are not particularly pleasant. The one up in the upper right is the goofy one that appears in Cairns, Australia. And not to be outdone, I want you to see the Vancouver statue, which has been painted over several times by folks in Vancouver, British Columbia. Next. What I tried to do in this analysis was find a rational basis on which to compare Cook and Vancouver in this modern post-colonial effort. And I came upon the framework that my alma mater, the University of California, has been using. They've used it on a number of naming issues. Probably the most controversial one was about Alfred Kroeber. Kroeber was the director of anthropology and probably the most famous anthropologist in the first half of the 20th century. His name was stricken from the department's headquarters building because he employed research practices that were always objectionable to Native Americans. He collected remains from Native graves without the consent. And in a particularly controversial discussion, he is criticized for the maltreatment of the Native American Ishi who came out of the wilderness near Lassen National Park. He employed him as a janitor and put him on display at the school's archaeological museum until he finally died of tuberculosis. And so the point of the analysis here from the University of California, and the one that I want to apply to Cook in Vancouver, is what was his personal conduct, particularly as to Indigenous people. Next. Cook had 3 voyages, and this is a very quick summary of his interaction with Native people on the first voyage. His first contact was in Tahiti, was friendly, was pretty famous. I think we all know the sailors took lovers, adorned themselves with tattoos, learned the language. And the most interesting part is they circulated throughout the island with Tahitians, without weapons, without any fear of their safety. There was a real simpatico relationship between the Tahitians and the British. So much so that at the end of their time in Tahiti, they took the high priest Tupaya on the expedition. He piloted the ship, helped them with translations later on in the voyage, taught local navigation, and even prepared a chart of the Polynesian islands. So again, I think it's fair to say that the British treated him as an equal and as an explorer like themselves. Unfortunately for Cook, the next 2 situations were much different. In New Zealand, the British were regularly confronted by the Maori warriors, and unknown to most people today, 9 Maori were killed in the first 3 days by the British. And it didn't improve much in the 2 weeks they were in New Zealand. When Cook first landed in Botany Bay, Australia, which is the classic discovery scene of Australian myth, you know, kind of like Washington crossing the Delaware. Cook was the Washington of Australia. Most of the Aboriginals, in fact, ran away. There were 2 who remained at their first landing, and Cook ended up shooting one in the leg because of his fear of being attacked. And although they were armed, the Aboriginals never attacked. They went up further to the Great Barrier Reef and had another encounter with the Aboriginals. It was slightly better, but there were frequent disagreements. Tupaya, unfortunately, died along with many of the other crew of disease in Batavia. Next. So this disparate scene kind of frames the issue for Australians today. 100 years ago, they imagined Captain Cook's first landing like the one in the upper left. This great white father coming upon this wilderness land, you know, words to that effect. But in fact, the black and white photo is more accurate. There were 2 Aborigines who confronted them and urged them to go away, and they came ashore anyway. Next. The second voyage was quite a bit different. Cook returned to New Zealand and Tahiti and charted a bunch of additional islands in the South Pacific. His contacts with the local people were much more diverse, and he learned about customs, religions, leadership, and there was a considerably improved reception. For his part, Cook adopted a zigzag route from the islands each summer toward the South Pole, looking for Terra Australis until he could prove that it didn't exist. The captain on his consort ship, Furneaux, was alone, separated from Cook. He sent 11 men in northern New Zealand, the northern part of the southern island of New Zealand, to a place called Grass Cove, looking for water and food stuff, kind of a common event for the mariners. They were ambushed and killed, and some believe, and there is considerable reporting about Maori cannibalism. With this having occurred, Furneaux abandoned the voyage. But when Cook came back to that site and learned of the incident, he did not seek revenge, and a considerable transformation from his first time in New Zealand. He was much more charitable toward the conduct of the indigenous people. Furneaux brought back a young Tahitian to England, and that Tahitian was treated by English society as an equal. He mingled with English society, and next, English society repaid Mai with these remarkable portraits done by probably the two foremost portraitures in England at the time. These both hang in the National Gallery of London. Next. The third voyage is the one I suppose most of us in Alaska care about. He spent up the first year in the South Pacific. He was a little bit more erratic than the second voyage, having problems with both his crew and the native people on shore. Familiarity, it seemed, bred contempt. His first contact in the North Pacific was at Kauai. The Hawaiians gave a tumultuous reception, particularly for Cook. He made landfall at Cape Foulweather, which is in Oregon, and then soon entered Nootka Sound, where they established quite friendly relations with the Moatchit, staying 4 weeks in Nootka. They then went to Prince William Sound and Cook Inlet in turn, with frequent contact with the Alutiiq and Dena'ina. Despite erroneous Russian maps that Cook carried, they found their way further north, encountering the Chukchi in Siberia, a little bit north of Bering Strait. And then they reached the ice pack. Going south, they met with people in Norton Sound and then spent 3 weeks on Alaska. And I think it's an interesting commentary on British perspectives. They were very unhappy with the Russian treatment of the local people. And I think we all know about the ways that the Russians conducted sea otter hunting at the time. Cook went back to Kealakekua Bay. Their first visit was pretty positive. The second time, I think we all are aware that Cook was killed in a melee over a stolen shore boat. In addition to Cook, 4 Marines and 20 Hawaiians were killed. Next. The importance, I think, of the Cook third voyage can't be underestimated, particularly when you consider the many drawings that John Weber did of the voyage. I've selected just a few focusing on our area. This is his first contact in Kauai. Next. These are outside and inside habitation views in Nootka Sound. Next. These are the people of Nootka Sound. Next. These are the people of Prince William Sound. Next. Just to remind you, because Cook Inlet is so important to us as Alaskans, the expedition entered Cook Inlet in May of 1778. William Bligh surveyed Kinnick Arm and found it was closed. James King attempted the Eastern Channel and was blocked by winds and tides. So Cook named it River Turnagain, the name it has today. We know of the British possession ceremony with Dene at Point Possession. I'd be happy to answer questions about that ceremony if people want to know a little bit more about that. I see that Aaron Leggett is one of our listeners, and he probably can respond as well. I think this is the first European contact with the Dene. Next. As they went further north past the Alaska Peninsula, past the outlet of the Yukon River, they crossed the Bering Strait and entered Chukchi territory to, I think, demonstrate Cook's ease with the indigenous people. You can see that he walked in, he and just a few of his officers, and spent time with armed Chukchi people, watching their ceremonies, interrelating pretty well. In the true spirit of the age of the Enlightenment, I would believe, and pretty inconsistent with what came later. We can certainly say, both as to the British and the Russians in this area. Next. Returning from the ice pack, still in 1778, they passed Norton Sound. Next. And then spent 3 weeks in Unalaska. Next. This, of course, shows the kayaks of the people of Alaska and their subterranean homes. Next. And as a result of Cook's voyage, this is the map of Alaska. Now, what he went to Alaska with was a bunch of islands and an imagined Northwest Passage shown in early Russian maps. And this is what he found, and this is the drawing of the first really accurate drawing of the Alaska landmass. Next. They then went to Kealakekua Bay, which is a matter that has been studied an awful lot, post-colonial and by those who are just advocates of Cook. There were 2 visits. The first visit was extremely friendly. Then they departed for Siberia, but a foremast broke in a storm and they had to return because they didn't know any other place to go in Hawaii to repair the foremast. And the reception was much, much different. And finally, there was the melee over the stolen shore boat, and Cook was killed. Next. These are Weber drawings of the reception during the first time in Hawaii. You can see that there were thousands of Hawaiians who visited, including the king of the island. Next. This is the king's gift to Cook, now in the New Zealand National Museum. Next. This is Weber's depiction of the death of Cook. From all perspectives, it's pretty accurate. You can see, obviously, there was quite the melee. The British didn't know how to swim. It suggests that Cook was trying to stop his men from firing into the crowd, but they did so anyway. Cook shot a shot himself, so probably helped incense the mob. Next. The story of Vancouver is much less known. It is started, I believe, by the effort of some mariners to sell books, and they depicted a lot of passageways that might still exist between Cook Inlet, Prince William Sound, or even Southeast Alaska back to the Atlantic. This one was done by John Mears. Next. Vancouver's voyage was much different. He did 3 summer surveys, basically from shore boats to get into the inner reaches of the land. These are modern depictions of the Vancouver voyage and how they might have related to the native people as they were surveying. Next. Although Vancouver did not have a Weber on board, he was principally a surveyor. He had a number of views of indigenous people. This is the village of Uquat on the inside of Nootka Sound. Next. This is McKenna's house. McKenna was probably the most famous native person on the West Coast in this era. He more or less traded sea otter skins with all the various European nations and Americans. Next. Vancouver visited with McKenna frequently. These are other villages encountered along the BC coastline. And this rather famous view is Vancouver's exiting Cook Inlet and running across a Russian fleet of sea otter hunters in kayaks. He, like Cook before him, was pretty disturbed with the way the Russians treated the people that they put in these kayaks, taking hostages of their families and the like. Next. Vancouver also went to California. He was essentially the first European to visit the Alta California missions. He was horrified by the treatment of the native people there, who they called neophytes. Next. Vancouver also visited Hawaii each year. He had a close personal relationship with Kamehameha and even arranged for the cessation of a treaty with Britain over the cessation of a cession of the Big Island. Next. In the end, Vancouver's voyage, all about surveying, produced these fine charts, and there are detailed ones about our area and all the way down the coast and Hawaii. Next. And those efforts, Cook and Vancouver's efforts, allowed the European map makers to finally develop accurate maps that included a reasonable depiction of Alaska and the West Coast. Remember, beforehand, there was an imagined southern continent and a Northwest Passage through Alaska. So those things were obviously disproved in these voyages. Next. So I'm happy to discuss this. This obviously merits a lot of discussion and consideration, and I hope you'll give me some of your thoughts about this in the questions. But the captains did not know about the empirical designs. They were trained as cartographers. They used colliers, not warships. They had reasonable relations with the native people despite these remarkable cross-cultural contacts, particularly in North America, where Cook enjoyed friendly relations with many different native tribes. During Vancouver's voyage, much the same. Vancouver had more contact with the native people probably than anyone of his generation from Europe. British observers were really distressed about the relations between the Russians and Spanish and their control of the colonies there. And as I indicated, Vancouver had a pretty remarkable relationship with the King of Hawaii. Next.
Jim, I got you at about 24 minutes, if you could wrap up in a minute or so.
2 slides.
Okay, great.
There has been a considerable amount of post-colonial scholarship by people much, much smarter than me. The focus has been on the South Pacific, as you might imagine, and Cook. Anne Salmond, a New Zealand anthropologist, Nicholas Thomas, an Australian historian, have both discussed this issue considerably and have discussed how Cook interacted with the native people in this remarkable cross-cultural contact. Glenn Williams, who was a longtime friend of mine and just passed away, had a similar discussion about the interaction with the native people of the Northwest Coast. Last slide. As we think about the issue of our Captain Cook statue in Anchorage, I'd like to show you the harbor view at Whitby, England. This is my picture. You'll see in the background Captain Cook statue that's been up for a long time. That's the one that was borrowed for Waimea, Hawaii, Victoria, and Anchorage. But note in the foreground the whalebone arch. We, the people of Anchorage, put that there 20 years ago. And I think it reflects that Cook had a very positive relationship with the native people and that we share that heritage with the people of England. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Jim. Another fascinating presentation. Thanks much. Again, let's punt questions until we get to the end. And finally, and certainly there's no intentional coincidence with Halloween on the horizon, but we're going to focus on murder. Betsy Linebaugh and Ed Schoenfeld are fellow retired ink-stained journalists from Southeast. And being the smarter member of the family, Betsy left journalism for a new career in social work and retired as a Coast Guard social worker. They both have been researching historic murders and the community response to them. And Betsy published a book on the subject in June, and they both lead walking tours in Juneau and Douglas on historic murders. I understand Betsy will do the bulk of today's presentation, and as an accomplished musician, maybe Ed can provide a little background music. So Betsy, please proceed.
All right. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I want to start by talking about the Historical Society and their decision to use conflict as the theme for this year's presentations. And when I was trying to figure out murder and conflict, I thought, well, that's even stupid that I would think about murder and conflict, because there's nothing more intimate than in conflict than murdering somebody. And certainly when you think about controversial figures, I would hope that murders would always be controversial figures. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's see if I can advance this appropriately. So while I'm going to be today's presenter, my husband, Ed Schoenfeld, has done a lot of research and work and preparation for the presentation. What we're going to be doing is talking about some of the many murders that we've researched over the last 4 years since we both retired and started looking at murder as a great retirement occupation. My daughter says we're killing it. So we're both longtime Alaska residents. I actually grew up in Sitka and worked for both newspapers, both in Sitka and Juneau. Ed spent his professional life in the media as a newspaper writer, editor, and public radio reporter. And we took the information that we've researched and done a few things with it. We do presentations like this one, but we usually just delve into one murder during those presentations. We also do walking tours for the Juneau Douglas City Museum. And this is a photo from one of those. We do downtown walking tours in Juneau and in Douglas. I also wrote a book that came out in June about 10 of those murders. And I can promise you that almost all but one of them have been completely forgotten. But the first murder we're going to talk about today is not forgotten. It is the murder that put the Birdman of Alcatraz in solitary confinement. In 1909, Robert Stroud was 18 years old when he committed the crime that led to his life in federal penitentiaries, his life and eventual death, actually, in federal penitentiaries. And it also led to the creation of the biography by Thomas Gaddis called The Birdman of Alcatraz, that was purportedly about Robert Stroud, and described somebody who had done this enormous amount of intellectual educational research into trying to best into, I guess, birds, but also he also learned languages and did scientific studies.
The Birdman of Alcatraz was in Alaska.
I'm sorry, could somebody mute? So Robert Stroud entered the federal penitentiary system in Juneau after killing somebody January 18th, 1909. And the story of who he killed in Thomas Gaddis's book is complete, almost complete fabrication. The person he killed is the same person, but the events themselves have been completely fabricated by Gaddis. Gaddis described a young man whose girlfriend has been brutally beaten by a local resident, and he then decides to go after that local resident in revenge, gets into a big fight with him, and in the ensuing struggle accidentally shoots him. That was the story that Gaddis presented. That, as Ed and I discovered when we started looking at the contemporaneous court records and the newspaper accounts, was absolutely not the case. Robert Stroud, at age 17, had ended up in Cordova, where he was working as something they called the Peanut Kid, buying snacks and selling them to women in the red light district and their clients. In doing that, he became friendly with a woman named Kitty O'Brien. That was actually her prostitute name. Her real name was Mrs. John Delaney. And the two of them decided to come down to Juneau and set her up in business. His job was to be her procurer or pimp. So he found a customer for her. It was, as I meant, middle of January, must have been dark, cold, nasty weather. And Charles Von Dahmer, a local bartender, offered to pay Kitty O'Brien $10 if she would spend the night with him at his cabin. She did so. At the end of the night, in the early morning hours, he paid her $1. She was enraged. She later told both a federal marshal and a newspaper reporter that she told Stroud to go, quote, kill the Russian, which he obligingly did. He took the $1 that she'd earned, bought bullets for their gun, went to Von Dahmer's cabin and shot him point blank in the head twice. The only sign of any kind of struggle, according again to those contemporaneous events, was that he had pulled all the pockets out of Von Dahmer's clothing because he stole every dime he could get from him. Gaddis then has him turning himself into police out of a sense of remorse. Actually, what happened was Stroud walked out of the cabin and saw two people watching him. They had heard the entire thing and they were eyewitnesses to the murder. So he turned himself in, but not out of remorse, out of just hopefully some sort of realization he was not going to be leaving Juneau without being arrested. He was originally indicted and charged with first-degree murder, but his mother and his mother's attorney intervened and ended up somehow winning him, probably because of his youth, a reduced sentence, thank you, to manslaughter. So he ended up with an 11-year sentence. He went off to McNeil Penitentiary, where all federal prisoners went from Alaska initially, and he earned a bad reputation there. He stabbed 2 different inmates over a period of years, didn't kill them, but then after those incidents, they sent him off to Leavenworth, the brand new prison in Kansas. And there he, in front of the entire prison population during a meal, killed a guard, stabbing him in the heart with a shank. Gaddis, again, in his book, describes this as sort of a revenge killing. Andrew Turner, Gaddis says, was a sadistic guard who refused to let Stroud's brother visit him the day of the murder. Again, there's no evidence that that's the case. He was honestly just a psychopath. everything that we can read says that. So Stroud went on to, like I say, live the rest of his life in solitary confinement after his mother once again was able to persuade, actually in this case, the Woodrow Wilson administration to commute a death sentence after this killing to life in prison. Prison officials then put him in solitary. He ended up actually doing all his bird research in Leavenworth, but after some period of time, people at Leavenworth got kind of tired of him and sent him on to Alcatraz. In Alcatraz, he was never allowed to have birds. So Gaddis, continuing his fabrication about Stroud's life, named a book, The Birdman of Alcatraz, when it would much more appropriately have been named The Birdman of Leavenworth. That book went on then to become a very well-known movie. The book came out in 1955. The movie came out a few years later, starring Burt Lancaster as a very sympathetic character. But again, that original story of the revenge killing in Juneau remains in the movie today. What does this story tell us? Well, it talks to us about romanticizing criminals. Gaddis had to make Stroud a much more sympathetic character to make his book work. It also talks about attitudes towards gay men, because Stroud was a very open homosexual and actually wrote narratives fantasizing about sex, especially with children, that prison officials were quite offended by. And at the time, being gay was considered to be a degenerate. So putting him in solitary confinement was one of the reasons that prison officials sort of went after this idea of keeping that degenerate away from the rest of the population. Talks about criminal justice reform and this idea that somebody can reform themselves in prison. There was a big movement actually to try to get Stroud out of prison after the book was published, because he was seen as such a sympathetic character and a victim of his poor impulse control. And finally, this talks about the power of a false narrative, because this false narrative of Stroud having killed in revenge for his girlfriend being beaten remains in today's internet stories about Stroud, and as I mentioned, completely false. So the next story, very different one. Lucy Shellhouse was a young woman who on the evening of September 5th, 1914, went to see these particular films at the Lyric Theater in Douglas. And she was on her own when she went, but there she met a friend, a guy named E.E. Senecal. He was a French-Canadian bartender. Everybody in Douglas knew as Frenchie. And Frenchie offered to walk Lucy home. Lucy was Tlingit. She was Alaska Native, and she had to live, consequently, in the Douglas Indian Village. That's where Alaska Natives were forced to live in Douglas. In Juneau, they had to live in the Juneau Indian Village. And if they were married to an Alaska Native, they lived in the either Douglas or Juneau Indian Village. So that evening, E.E. Senecal and Lucy are walking into the Douglas Indian Village when they encounter her recently former husband. They've been divorced within just a few weeks, Ed Hunsaker. Hunsaker was a miner at the Treadwell gold mine, which was next door to Douglas. He was about 20 years older than Lucy, and he was obviously enraged at seeing her with another man. According to newspaper accounts, he called Senecal, quote, a vile name. Senecal knocked him to the ground. Hunsaker, either then or later, depending on the newspaper account, shot them both on the street. According to one of the accounts, as Lucy leaned over the body of her friend Frenchie, he came up behind her with a gun and shot it through the back of her head. It was just a horrible crime. So what's fascinating about this case is how the newspapers described Lucy. The Daily Empire in Juneau actually described Lucy as Tlingit, an eagle from the eagle moiety from Hoona, and having been well educated. She'd attended both the Sheldon Jackson Mission School in Sitka, and then from there had gone on to the Chemawa boarding school in Salem, and had graduated from there. This image, I wish I knew whether Lucy was in the photo. I don't, because they're unnamed, but this is the graduating class around the period of time she would have graduated. And it gives you an idea of how few students graduated from this very large boarding school. So it was a real accomplishment that she had achieved the level of education that she had, and the newspaper recognized that. Again, very unusual for the time. in a later story, the Douglas paper actually referred to her only by a derogatory word that is typically used about Alaska Native women and American Indian women. That was the only thing they called her in their account of the crime. They didn't even note the fact that she had any kind of relationship with Hunsaker. So the fact that this information about Lucy came out in the paper tells us something as former reporters, which is she either knew that reporter or she knew a friend of the reporters, because otherwise that kind of detail wouldn't have been put in there. And she would have literally just been another anonymous woman, maybe unnamed, who was killed. This story talks to us about racism. She's being forced to live in a segregated part of town. She's called a denigrated word. It talks to us about the view of domestic violence, which is this fantastic headline, Triple Tragedy Enacted in Town of Douglas. This isn't two people murdered on the street and then Hunsaker, as the federal marshals knocked on his cabin, shot himself and killed himself. So he wasn't ever arrested. And this sort of stuff happens today. One of the things I did as a social worker was worked in the domestic violence field. And I remember vividly an article in the Anchorage Daily News that was very, very similar to this, about a man who killed his ex-wife and then killed himself. And it was basically described as this double tragedy. This also talks about the role of divorce. One of the things that surprised us about this story and other ones that we looked at was divorce was not nearly as uncommon as we would have anticipated in these early days of Alaska's history. This next story, 1923, happened in downtown Juneau. The Ketchikan cigar store was inhabited by two women. They were both former prostitutes out of Ketchikan, who came up to Juneau to start their brothel, the Ketchikan cigar store. Cigar stores have been euphemisms for brothels around the world for many years. Luella Bodway and Hilda Weiss. Their bodies were found around 1:30 in the morning on Monday morning. Their porter was leaving a pool hall around 1:30, noticed lights on at the Ketchikan cigar store in downtown Juneau, and went in to see if his clients, these two women, needed coal. They didn't need coal. They were both dead. They'd been shot in the head. Hilda had been savagely beaten. And the bodies were still warm. In fact, when a doctor came to the scene just a few minutes later, he said blood was still flowing from the bodies. So we know that the killings had happened very, very recently. Pretty quickly, in fact, that very night, Harry Johnson was brought in for questioning by the coroner's jury. And this is interesting because it's 1:30 in the morning on a Monday morning. Could there be a quieter time in most communities? Not in Juneau. In Juneau, there's a crowd that gathers as soon as the police come to the brothel. And that crowd included a bunch of witnesses, people who'd heard the gunshot. Almost everybody thought, by the way, it was somebody cutting wood. And the next door landlady of the Nanana cigar store saw Harry Johnson leaving the Ketchikan cigar store shortly before the bodies were found. Harry Johnson was, he was later in prison called Limey Johnson, was originally from London. He'd come to Canada as a young man, 16, and was enlisted by Canadian Armed Forces into the battlefront of World War I. So although he was only 16 years old, he lied about his age, said he was 18. And in Canada, they actually weren't supposed to enlist anybody until they were 21. But I think they were probably desperate for soldiers. So they sent this 16-year-old boy over to fight in the front lines of World War I. And he was there for 4 years. He was wounded several times. Harry Johnson was down on his luck this night. He'd written a couple of checks, didn't have any money to cover it. He had bought a gun that very evening, again, giving you an idea of the hoppin' nature of Juneau, that he could find a gun on Sunday evening downtown Juneau. And he was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He pled out. The prosecution allowed him to plead to 2 counts of manslaughter, which for his crime had been theft, everything he could find from
Well, somebody better do something.
Hey, Betsy, this is David. I think we've lost your audio.
Hi, David. This is Cody. It looks like her internet might have cut out entirely, so I will be looking
We'll
forward
give you a
to
second.
to bring it back on.
This is so interesting. I can just listen to all of these.
So I wonder if we should try to take a couple questions while Betsy gets back on.
Brina suspects foul play in the comments.
So Cody, what do you recommend?
Yeah, I will work to get her back on, and if the others want to start answering questions or anything like that, that might be good.
Okay, so for the audience, it looks like Betsy's lost her internet connection. And as we try to work to get her back, let's see if we can take a couple of questions. I'm not seeing audience questions. Maybe I'm looking somewhere the wrong place, but I had a couple questions of both Russ and Jim. Russ, could you talk a bit about the public perception of Alaska in the United States in the era that you discussed? Was it sort of a land of mystique, or was the sort of resonance of the Seward ice box and people kind of laughed it off? Was that still out there?
So, the public only knew what they were fed through the press and through publications. And so, one of the themes of the era was, as long as you could get into press, you could establish yourself to a degree as an expert, and however you viewed the portion of Alaska that you had experienced or adopted as your area. So I think overall, if we're to frame that question from the perspective of a census, when we look at the 1880 and 1890 census, for those who actually read those government documents, it provided a reasonably accurate picture of Alaska at the time, especially given the resources that had been expended to look at those areas. Obviously, a lot to learn in the indigenous side, because these weren't authored by indigenous residents or authors, and so that's why Petroff's contributions are so important, is because of any of our so-called outsiders or experts that were publishing, Petroff was closest to understanding the language and to being able to communicate with the people in that way. I think you're muted, David.
It looks like Betsy's back on. Betsy, are you with us?
Not seeing her yet.
Give Cody a minute to work his magic.
Let me try here.
So sorry about that.
There you are.
Yeah, here I am. Let me see if I can get back into my presentation. Am I sharing the screen?
Don't see it yet.
All righty. Let me just try that. There's the PowerPoint. Allow. All right. How are we doing?
Good. You're ready to go.
Great. And I don't know where I ended. Can you tell me where we were when I stopped? If you, I guess.
I think you were a slide or so past this. You were the two women who were murdered at the cigar store.
Okay, so the women have been murdered at the cigar store. They've got the suspect. He's charged with 2 accounts of first-degree murder and is allowed to plead to 2 counts of manslaughter, sentenced to 20 years. And David, was I able to tell you about the his background as a World War I vet?
You were talking about that.
Yes.
Okay, so he had a really horrific war experience, and there was some description by the prosecution later that he could probably have pleaded insane, which he did not. So what does this story tell us? Well, it talks to us about the nature of Juneau's economy, that we had this bustling downtown in the middle of a Sunday night where all these crowds come up and people they're witnesses and people have seen stuff. Somebody's been able to buy a gun. And that was a function of the fact we had a very prosperous gold mine town and a big gold mine right downtown. So there were people who were working 24/7 all the time. This talks to us about the impact of World War I and this, I can't say poor young man because he really did commit a dreadful crime, but certainly his personal history was a devastating one. And his experience as a soldier definitely would have impacted his later life experience. It talks about the public nature of prostitution. This is the last story that we came across where prostitutes are again just defined as prostitutes in the newspaper. You'll note this newspaper headline says the double murders committed in a Front Street resort. That was a euphemism for a brothel. The other euphemism for prostitute was the women of underworld, the women of the underworld. That makes them sound so much more exotic than just a plain old prostitute. And in this particular case, this was one of the few cases we came across where successful use of physical evidence was used to convict somebody. Because typically, if you didn't have an eyewitness to the crime, there were no fingerprints, there was certainly no DNA. All the things that people now rely on for convictions really didn't exist so much then. So the fact that they found him so quickly because of that 24/7 nature of downtown, and they found physical evidence at the scene of the crime, in his room, really led to that successful conviction. So last story, Guy and Marjorie Prince. Guy and Marjorie Prince were both adult children of well-to-do California families. They had both been divorced in California with other relationships and basically had shown up in Juneau right around the same time, probably met in a bar because they were both pretty heavy drinkers apparently, and got married. Things did not go well. Marjorie was actually about 10 years older than Guy. But they were both being supported by family members down in California. They both had stipends. So they were working part-time, and then they were relying on their family's support to make it. On this particular day in 1946, Guy called police and said, "I've killed my wife. I want you to come arrest me." So the police obliged. They showed up and found her body. He's sitting next to her body. She's lying on the bed, and he's wrapped a nylon pair of stockings around her neck twice. He told police he wasn't going to call them until he knew she was dead. Well, he was accurate. She was very dead. There was no sign of a struggle, and he, according to police, appeared to be cold sober. So when his defense attorney persuaded the prosecution to drop a first-degree murder charge to manslaughter, it must have been pretty astounding. How did that happen? Probably because his brother, who'd been the one sending him money, his father had passed away. His brother got a very well-known defense attorney here in Juneau to take the case. William Faulkner told the judge he didn't take criminal cases anymore, but he took this one as a favor to this well-known lawyer down in California. And Faulkner went on to encourage the judge and the prosecution basically not even to sentence Guy to jail. If he really should just be put away in an institution somewhere because he obviously had a drinking problem. He'd been in a car accident and had some mental health issues. He didn't even know what he was doing. He had no recollection of the event. It was just, he shouldn't even be put in jail. The prosecutor amazingly accepted this, probably intimidated by Faulkner. The judge did not. The judge gave him 20 years, but that wasn't the end of it. I found, so McNeil Island, which is where he was sent, had no records of this guy, but they have records, actually very few records of most of their inmates. So I don't know when he got out of jail, but I do know that he got out of jail long before the end of his 20-year sentence. He ended up out of jail in, less than 10 years, because 10 years after he was sentenced, there was an obituary for him in a California newspaper. And at that point, he'd already married a third time and had a daughter. So he did not serve very long in his sentence, most likely, again, because of the influence and money behind him from his brother. So what does this story tell us? I think this story talks to us about the role of remittance men and women. If you're not familiar with that term, it came up in Britain years ago when they started sending their ne'er-do-well younger sons off, particularly to Canada, sometimes Australia. And in exchange for staying far, far away from home, they would be sent a stipend. And that's pretty much what was going on with both Guy and Marjorie. They were far, far away from home, where they had both created some issues, and were receiving stipends from their families. This talks again about attitudes of domestic violence. A guy told police that the reason he killed his wife is because although they were separated, he was living in an apartment at the time, he'd come to check on her at her house and found her in bed with another man. So that was his reasoning for why it was okay for him to kill her. And apparently the prosecution must have accepted that to some degree. It talks about attitudes toward alcoholism, or what they called at the time dipsomania, which sounds so much more intriguing somehow, that if you're drinking, that you're basically not liable for your actions. And that was something that was in place for a very long time with regard to convictions in court cases. And finally, it once again talks about that power of privilege and the fact that his family had money and influence and were able to get him off pretty easily. So that's it. Those are my questions. I'm ready for questions if Dave's ready for me to answer them.
Okay, thanks very much. Sorry we lost you mid-sentence, but you...
Well, I'm sorry.
I'm curious, did you guys determine whether there was a big disparity in sentencing between people convicted of murder based on race, or was it more based on privilege and status?
Our experience was more based on privilege and status, which of course includes race, right? Mm-hmm. Because your status in a society is dependent in large part on your race. So we came across very, very, very few incidents where the murderer was actually Alaska Native. And in fact, when the two Alaska territorial legislators went to the territorial legislature and said, we shouldn't be imposing the death penalty in Alaska, they based this on the fact that they had sentenced 11 men to die during territorial days, and 8 of them were men of color. And they said the vast majority of the people killing people in Alaska are not men of color, they're white men. And yet the vast majority of the people being hanged are not white. And the territorial legislature listened, and they abolished the death penalty 2 years before statehood.
And do you all continue to follow murder cases in Southeast? Are there any different trends now versus the 20s and 30s that you focused on?
You know, it's funny to me because when Ed and I started working this, we were really relying on our knowledge of local contemporary murders, and it was just too painful, not just for us, but for our audience. We would be doing stories that we were called covering, Ed in particular, and our audience members have been on the jury, or they taught the defendant, or it was too close. So we have really ended up focusing on pre-statehood stories almost exclusively.
Okay, well, thanks very much. If Jim Marnett is still with us, I had a question of him, which is, I assume that Cook was an international celebrity, and how was his death announced to the world? And what was the reaction at the time, or is my assumption mistaken?
It looks like Jim is rejoining us. There might have been an
Okay.
outage.
Technical glitch. We're about out of time, so I'll just give him a second.
I can also take this moment just to let people know that the recording for all of these will be exactly at the same link where you watched it live. And the chat continues to be live too. So if Jim would feel comfortable answering any people's questions, in the chat after the fact, that's also an option.
Okay. And we probably ought to wrap up here. The next session begins at 11, which is on native sovereignty issues with a couple of great panelists, Will Schneider and Steve Haycox. And with that, I wanted to thank our three panelists today, all the great research they did, and for sticking to time. So thanks so much, and we'll see everybody in about a half an hour.